Welcome to episode 129 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. Joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag, and we've got a special end-of-year wrap-up where Anshel and I are going to talk about initially 2 important happenings this year in the world of 5G. And then we're each going to provide a prediction for next year. So with that said, let's get started with my first look back to 2022. And I got to give T-Mobile, a little bit of visibility here in what they're doing to sort of transform their go-to-market with respect to focusing on enterprise. And, as you and I have talked, my friend, on prior podcasts, from years past, T-Mobile was very, very disruptive in the consumer space, but very, very light with respect to what they were doing in the enterprise relative to competitors AT&T and Verizon. But in 2022, that changed remarkably. And you and I had an opportunity to spend time with T-Mobile at their first analyst summit. We co-authored a Forbes article that our chief analyst, Patrick Moorhead, also contributed to. But from my perspective, the company has come a long way with respect to enterprise. They have their advanced network solutions that are based on different industry verticals that we've spoken to in the past. And I really like their approach in offering both public, private, and hybrid networking solutions to address some of these use cases within smart city IoT, manufacturing, and that sort of thing. So again, give the company kudos as they more adequately balance out their focus on consumer and the enterprise. And I'm expecting to see big things at the analyst summit. They threw up a slide with different logos. Some of that was under non-disclosure, but I do expect that as we move into next year, that we're going to be hearing a lot more from T-Mobile for Business. So before you move to your first look back, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think T-Mobile for Business is definitely, changing the landscape, both for 5G private solutions, but also for enterprise in general.
Yeah.
And I think that they have shown that T-Mobile now is more of a, enterprise and consumer operator. Obviously, there's a lot more, time and work to be done to make them a big player in the space, but it seems like they've really started from a good place. And I also commend them for not jumping the gun and doing things too quickly. And I think that they are, in a constantly listening mode, trying to understand what their customers might need and how they can satisfy new customers. So it'll be really interesting to see how this works out long term. But I think the realization is that the enterprise use cases for 5G in many ways are much greater than the consumer ones, at least, especially this early on.
I agree. I believe, and I think I've spoken to this on prior podcasts. I think over 90% of the really disruptive use cases around 5G will be in the enterprise space, and I think half of that addressable market will be in manufacturing automation. But yeah, it'll be interesting. Obviously they're playing catch up with their competitors, but I'm looking forward to more news from them in the new year. But with that said, let's go to your first look back, and you want to talk about 5G network maturity.
Yeah, so I think the real vague reason I chose 5G networks maturity is just because, if we just look at the US market, and I know we'll broaden from there, but if you just look at the US market, this is the year that Verizon and AT&T both rolled out their mid-band networks.
Yeah.
And this is also the year where their networks actually started to catch up to where T-Mobile was. And then we saw T-Mobile not only continue to roll the rollout of their mid-band network, which I would argue, came into its own earlier this year, if not last year.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at they're now doing 3 carrier aggregation, and they're doing standalone across all bands that they're offering. So it's really interesting because all the networks are much more mature. And I think the 5G experience today is considerably better across all 3 major carriers in the US than it was, say, at the beginning of the year. And I would say the experience overall is much better, and I think consumers will probably forget about how unhappy they were last year with their 5G networks. And I think these maturity thing, there will be continued improvements. I think Verizon, AT&T, we'll talk about something later in the podcast we'll be doing. But I think if you broaden it to a more global scale, India has finally launched their 5G network. China has standalone in some places,
Yeah.
and Europe is, really gaining momentum overall,
Yeah.
and starting to adopt standalone as well. So I think we're seeing the beginnings of true 5G as the next topic may we'll be bringing up later in the podcast. Is I think the future for 5G networks overall.
Yeah, I agree with you. A lot of progress this year. I mean, one of the challenges in the United States was with AT&T and Verizon and their mid-band spectrum gap, like you mentioned. C-band allowed them to close the gap there and to begin to deploy it. And both AT&T and Verizon have made a lot of inroads in getting that mid-band spectrum deployed. T-Mobile was in the enviable position having those 2.5 gigahertz assets from the Sprint merger acquisition. And so that's given them, a head start. We've talked about that in the past, but I agree with you. I mean, things are starting to finally coalesce. And what I'm going to be really excited about next year is, and you're going to talk a little bit more about this on your look forward, is just once these networks become mature, to start seeing some of these enterprise and consumer use cases that flow out of it. So 2023 should be actually really exciting. So, but let me do my second look back for this year, and I want to talk about private networking and 5G as a service. So I think, I would kind of call 2022 the year of disaggregation, cloudification from a telecom perspective, and then really, private networking and 5G as a service. And this is going to allow from my perspective, mobile network operators to monetize what they're investing in these next generation 5G networks beyond access. And manufacturing automation, I talked about that earlier when I was talking about T-Mobile and its business focus. I think we're going to see a lot of these POCs, these proof of concepts, move into production. I think we're going to see a lot more momentum. And then the other point that I'll make around this is that there are multiple paths to private cellular networking. 5G as a service has risen from the likes of Cisco and HPE as well. Solana, I've spoken about Solana in the past. They're a startup that's been partnered with HPE Aruba. They're beginning to see lots of momentum. I think just recently there was a Fierce Wireless, the article that talked about Solana. But at the end of the day, I think you're going to start seeing some maturity with respect to, again, moving from proof of concepts into deployments. And really, the timing couldn't be better with a lot of reshoring of manufacturing coming back to the U.S. Based on concerns around China and supply chain and that sort of thing. And manufacturing automation is going to be key. And also, there's no secret that we need to improve semiconductor production as well. TSMC has opened a facility in Arizona. Samsung is committed to building a brand new fab just outside of my hometown of Austin and Taylor. And so the timing couldn't be better. And I think we're going to see a lot of examples of the practicality of private networking as well as 5G as a service. But what are your thoughts there?
I think there's some really interesting things that are occurring. I think the one that really caught my eye was the T-Mobile announcement that happened, I think, last week.
Yeah.
Where they basically just said we're cloudifying the whole thing with Cisco.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, all the conversations that I've had with AWS at reInvent, and just in general, is that it seems like a lot of networks are becoming much more flexible as they need to be.
Yeah.
And the best way of doing that is to have some kind of cloudification strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think long term that's going to continue to become a thing, especially as edge needs to come closer to the user.
Yeah.
Because the way the word edge is almost as dynamic as the networks are becoming.
Right.
Um, and as a result of that, I think we're just going to see more cloudification and pushing things closer to the edge. But you know what? I also think the one thing I've always noticed in the tech industry, and kind of almost as like a function of the universe, is there's like consolidation and then there's like um, increasing of entropy. So there's like this constant way ebb and flow of centralization and decentralization. I think right now we're moving towards a decentralization, but I have a feeling there will be a point where we re-centralize things once again.
Yeah.
And I think that will happen with 5G networks as well.
Yeah, and you talk about edge computing. I mean, when I'm asked about, what's the importance of edge with respect to 5G, I liken it to basically being a supercharger. So, putting computing resources closer to the creation of data at that near edge, far edge, however you want to define it, is going to unlock performance. And that's why we're seeing the mobile network operators in the US in particular investing very heavily in MEC with AWS and Azure and Google Cloud Platform to a lesser degree. But yeah, I couldn't agree further with you on that point. But with that, let's go to your second look back this year, and you want to talk about fixed wireless access.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about FWA, mostly because I feel like it was something that you and I saw coming this year,
Yeah.
and it very much it was a thing this year. And I think the reason why FWA is a big deal and why I think it's worth talking about this year is one, it it offers people real competition and choice when it comes to internet. And I also think that it gives operators long term, another opportunity to increase subscribers, find new revenue sources, and also potentially offer bundling deals, which we know operators love to do.
Yeah.
And I think long term FWA has this capability, and I believe this superpower to give people access to the internet and faster speeds that they might not have ever had, because no one would ever dig, to their premises, or they just never had anything because no one bothered. And
Yeah.
now with FWA, we could have people in rural areas getting upwards of 50 to 100 megabits, where they used to maybe get a megabit if they
Right.
even, if they even got that. So I really think that FWA this year was a big deal, and I think it's made a lot of waves across the industry, and the momentum is still going strong.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I've stated this before. I kind of point to fixed wireless access as 5G's first killer use case, right? And to your
Yeah.
point, especially in rural areas where it's going to be completely cost prohibitive to lay fiber. Although you have AT&T that's investing in certain parts of rural America to build out fiber and to sort of, you know, basically plant a franchise so that they can build revenue off of the fixed broadband as well as have the fiber, support, critical backhaul for 5G. And I've spoken about FWA as well. I mean, it's going to be a critical element in my mind in bridging the digital divide. And I completely agree with you this year. We saw T-Mobile surpass 2 million subscribers. Verizon is adding subscribers to its service, although their challenge has been, getting that FWA service, on their mid-band spectrum. T-Mobile has done that at the low end, and they're well on their way to building out their mid-band FWA service as well. And also T-Mobile is able to offer now a business internet version of that. I think they have two different flavors, depending on the data that's consumed there. But I agree with you, and I think we're going to hear more about FWA next year, and I think we're going to hear more about FWA from AT&T as well. Again, AT&T tends to lead with fiber because they've built a 10 billion plus business on that. ARPU is really strong. But I recently spent time with CEO John Stankey this year, and they have an FWA service. It's more focused on business users, but I think we're gonna see more of that from AT&T come into play as we roll into 2023. But with that, let's move to my prediction for next year, and I know you've got one here in a minute as well. But my prediction is I believe Open RAN is finally going to hit its stride. There have been a lot of challenges with Open RAN. I mean, one has been around coalescing the standards, and there have been a lot of consortiums in play. The ORAN Alliance, the Open RAN Policy Coalition, TIP at one point this year trying to harmonize both efforts together. And it just takes time to do that and have the necessary working groups to work all of that out. And the other big challenge in my mind has been integration. And so traditionally, the Ericssons, the Samsungs, the Nokias of the world commanded a pretty tidy sum for putting together these networks, designing these networks, and integrating these networks for the mobile network operators. And so that leaves an opportunity for systems integrators and others to come in and sort of integrate it. And I think that's been one of the challenges. But you're beginning to see momentum behind that. I think you're seeing SI step up that are getting involved in private networking projects. And we've talked about some of these, government related, military related. We've talked about some private 5G network deployments to support transportation and logistics for the Marine Corps as an example. So I think we're going to definitely see more of that next year. And I think again, it's just taken time. It's a journey. And finally, I believe things are at a point where standards have matured. You've had 2 or 3 players really arise as being key participants on both the core and the RAN side of things. And so I think Open RAN should have a really big year next year. But what are your final thoughts there before we move to your prediction?
I think Open RAN. I think my beliefs for Open RAN are that it will be successful, but I think it will take longer than next year.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit of a longer horizon. But I do think that it does fill a necessary need within the US specifically, and I think also Europe, to have more homegrown networking equipment.
Yeah.
And to provide competition with the existing vendors, whether they be Ericsson or Nokia or Samsung. And I think that there will be continued pressure to make this be successful. But I do think it will probably be something that happens more in private networking situations than I think in a commercial network. And I think that if we do get Open RAN in a commercial network, it will probably happen in 6G.
I agree with you. I mean, the plans were set for 5G, RAN, well before the whole Open RAN thing came together. But to your point, the ability for it to domesticate the 5G supply chain, bring some software-defined players, into the mix, I think is super positive. I agree with you. We're going to see it, I believe, in greenfield network deployments, Dish in the US, Rakuten in Japan, Reliance in India. And it's going to be, I think, less of a brownfield opportunity until we get to 6G. But not to steal your thunder, because we've been sort of teasing your forward-looking prediction this year, but I'll let you take it away.
Yes. So I think
drum roll, please.
Standalone starts to get real momentum. There it is. I said it.
Yeah.
I don't really think it's that big of a deal, because I think we've been talking about this and teasing this for the last few weeks, if not months.
Yeah.
But I think T-Mobile made their announcement that their low band and mid band is now standalone. So they're essentially an all standalone 5G network now. I think the word standalone you're going to hear a lot more of next year. And you're going to hear it more from AT&T and Verizon, and I think other carriers as well.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is because now the networks have become mature enough and have good enough coverage where the users can actually take advantage of new use cases and application developers can rely on the ability of the network to deliver speed, latency, network slicing, all the features that were supposed to come with 5G 2020.
Yeah.
And now we're getting them 2023 basically.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say for people who are not as familiar with the 5G standards, we weren't supposed to get 5G in 2019. It was supposed to be 2020. They
Mhm.
introduced NSA
Yeah.
to get us there in 2019, and NSA stuck around a little too long.
Yeah.
So, you can blame the pandemic for that. You can blame all kinds of things for it. But the reality is that we've spent, I think, too long on NSA.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a lot of people are upset with the experience that they're getting on 5G.
Yeah.
Whether that's because of DSS or other reasons, but the reality is real 5G is coming next year. And I don't think a lot of people really want to hear that, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's when we'll see developers and operators starting to work to implement new 5G use cases and really make, this thing what it promised to be.
I agree. I think, so with standalone, again, just to remind our viewers and listeners that that's matching core components with RAN in a non-standalone scenario. They were basically upgrading the RAN and then, leaving the LTE core intact as sort of that tweener. And I agree with you. I think it kind of went a little longer than people expected. And the other point that you mentioned, with T-Mobile as an example, they started building out their low band assets, within standalone, and so now they've moved to mid band. And as you and I have talked on prior podcasts, mid band spectrum provides the best balance of propagation and performance. And really, that's where I believe a true promise of 5G is going to be found, is within those standalone mid band spectrum build outs to provide, that optimal balance of performance and coverage. But with that said, my friend, it's been a great year. We've recorded a ton of podcasts. I think maybe we only skipped 1 or 2 weeks when you and I were road warriors over the last year. But I really enjoy doing these with you, and I'm looking forward to more next year with you. So why don't you take us home?
Likewise. And I also enjoyed doing this. I hope you guys enjoyed listening. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. And that if anyone would like to reach out to us to provide insights for a specific 5G topic for a future podcast in the new year, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.